The deep blue were the countries the Americans cared about before World War II. The medium blue were the new partners in this new global order. The orange are the other guys. Americans don't like talking about them. And light blue is the field of competition. It was a global fight with global consequences, and the United States could never deny battle. But then one idle Tuesday, in the very definition of pent-up demand, the Germans threw a party, and it was over. And it had never occurred to the Americans that the global system could go anywhere except for the logical endpoint of nuclear annihilation. We had no plan for what was going to happen the next day, and the map changed. And there's a lot of gray up there, a lot of places the Americans don't have a firm opinion on. Now, the person who was in charge at this moment of transition back in 1989 was George Herbert Walker Bush. From a foreign policy point of view, by far the most skilled president the United States has ever had. He worked with the CIA, he was vice president, Office of Budget, ambassador to China, served in the House of Representatives. He had excellent relations with every world leader who mattered, and personal relationships with everyone across the American political spectrum. He was the right person at the right time, in the right place, in the right job, with the right contact list and the right disposition, so of course Americans voted him out of office. And we started down the parade of morons. Bill Clinton was arguably the smartest president the United States has had since Jefferson himself, but he had an attention deficit issue. He also saw himself as a domestic leader. Wasn't interested in foreign affairs. And so when he realized that he had a summit the next day, he would kind of hunker down with the State Department and CIA desk officers and cram for the test the next morning like he was a millennial before his time. And frustratingly, he would hit it out of the park every time, but there would be no follow-up. So for the 8 years of the Clinton administration, we really only had about 2 months of foreign policy. Then we had W. Call it what it was. We had a monochromatic foreign policy that dealt with one issue in one region to the exclusion of everything else. Barack Obama came in. Now, Obama was kind of a strange cat by American standards. He demonstrated in his final 6 months as president, in a series of kind of exit interviews with the media, a command of the details and the context of foreign affairs that I have never seen out of an American elected leader. But he had this weird personality quirk. He hated people. And no American president met with his own cabinet secretaries fewer times or went to Capitol Hill fewer times than Barack Obama. So for 8 years, we had no foreign policy at all. There is more going on here than Donald Trump simply being the fourth moron. The glory, the horror of Donald Trump is that at his core, he has a really good point. The global order the Americans created in the 1940s no longer serves American strategic interests. But economically, it was never supposed to. The Americans create an environment that subsidizes the alliance to fight the Soviets, but it doesn't use that for its own economic purposes, because then it wouldn't be a bribe. I could give you 1,000 reasons why the United States will be just fine without the global structures that we've all become used to, but really, you only need one. The United States is not a trading nation. And as long as that is the case, as long as the United States is the country on this planet with the lowest involvement as a percentage of GDP in international commerce, it can go its own way. And it is. A couple other points to throw in there. Let's talk demography. Now, this is a standard demographic profile. We've got children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. This is Mexico. This is a consumption-led demography. Because whenever the bulge in your structure is below roughly age 40, it's all about the spending, kids, cars, college, homes. When American policymakers look at a country like Mexico, we don't see a competitor. All of the low value-added jobs in the United States left back in the 60s and 70s. This is a complementary system. Mexico does the lower-end manufacturing, it does the assembly, the United States does the design work. Trade goes back and forth. You may have noticed that the Trump administration stopped yelling at Mexico about trade about 2 years ago. They've moved on to other issues. This is a country that the United States can integrate with. This is not. Canada is a mature demography. It's no longer consumption-led. It has a lot of people aged 40 to 65. These people aren't doing a lot of spending. They're doing a lot of investing. They're preparing for retirement. But you take a market like this with a super saturated, mature worker bloc, and they can compete in international markets at below average labor costs for that skill set. But they don't have enough people in their 20s and their 30s to absorb what those people produced. They must export the difference. One of the reasons the Trump administration came down so hard on Canada in trade talks is they were willing to admit that Canada has become the competitive system to the American market, but yet it can't survive without the American market. Now, if your aging can't get reined in, eventually you turn into something like Japan. How do you run a first world economy without a first world workforce? Well, fun fact, robots. Since they don't vote yet, it doesn't matter where you put them. So the Japanese have become exports not in outsourcing or in resourcing, but in desourcing, picking up entire chunks of their industrial plant and dropping it down into other countries to get on the right side of currency and political risk. It's working for them. Here's the US. The US is kind of in the middle. There's two bulges in here we need to kind of kick around a little bit. First, at the top, you've got the baby boomers, which are the largest generation as a percentage of the population in American history. And that bulge and that capital-rich demographic has made the United States capital-rich, unprecedentedly capital-rich, exorbitantly capital-rich, perhaps a little too capital-rich. Because all those boomers and that capital-rich demographic trying to get ready for retirement have pushed down their cost of capital, pushed down the rate of return. This is why we're all here, right? You're trying to find that mythical extra 1% of return. So is the entire baby boomer cadre. But in just 3 years, those baby movers move from net contributors to the investment network to net takers because they all move into retirement. Think about how it works. When you're 35, you have a small income, and a small sliver of that small income is put away into savings. When you're 55, it's a bigger pie, and you put a big fat wedge of it away. And when you're 64 3/4, you probably put as much as you possibly can. And then you retire, and you never add to it again. Cheaper, more available, easier terms on capital, and then all of a sudden, nothing. The year 2022 is the year that the majority of the boomers move into retirement, which means that the cost of capital in that year will at least quadruple. Next block down that matters, the millennials. This is normally where I would like to spend about 20 minutes talking about why the millennials are a waste of skin, but we don't have that kind of time. So instead, we're going to talk about all the reasons that we should all be grateful for the millennials. This won't take nearly as long because there's only 3 reasons. So, number 1, consumption. All of those juice bar memberships and that filet mignon dog food and that fat-free, sugar-free, gluten-free, cruelty-free beard butter and all those goddamn scooters, it all adds up. Millennial consumption has kept the United States out of recession since 2009. The US probably would have had 3 recessions since then otherwise. And they're young enough and there's enough of them that that consumption pulse has another 4 years left to run. That's fantastic. Second, if you fast forward to the year 2030, when the millennials are in charge of the United States, and I cry inside a little thinking about that, they can fill out the tax-paying class in a way that the Gen X never could. So everything you've heard about the fiscal cliff and the coming financial calamity, totally true. Pay attention to that. The snake swallowing the watermelon, it's real. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's a millennial, which also makes me cry a little inside. But if you look at the rest of the rich world without the Americans, there really aren't all that many millennials. This isn't a snake swallowing a watermelon. This is a snake swallowing a freight train. And most countries in the Western world and in East Asia are already past the point of no return demographically. That is enough to kill most countries, even if the Americans remain involved.